From Florence, Italy, the city of inspiration for sculptors in ages past and for centuries to come, you're listening to The Sculptor's Funeral. Good day to you all, and welcome to The Sculptor's Funeral, the podcast about figurative sculptors, both dead and not so dead. And I'm your host, Jason Arkles, a sculptor and educator living and working in Florence, Italy, where all the great sculptors are dead, and I don't feel so well myself. Now, looking through the biographies of various sculptors throughout history, we see that there are times and places and circumstances where and when it's just easier to become a sculptor than at other times. As with most pursuits in life, some people just have an easier time than others. Michelangelo, Bernini, Houdon, and many other first-rank sculptors in history were practically born to their craft at the right time, in the right place, and with the right support, whether that was having a father who was a sculptor or being discovered by a powerful patron at an early age. And it has to be said that for most Americans, born in the 19th century, finding one's way into a successful career in sculpture or even into a decent artistic education was exceptional and against the odds, regardless of natural ability or economic status. The United States simply never had the national, official, governmental support of the arts that most European nations had enjoyed for centuries. Alongside the lack of governmental patronage was the lack of national schools. As I have mentioned in previous episodes, Americans generally had to travel to Europe for decent training, and the United States was also late to the game in terms of developing a nationally recognized aesthetic before the advent of modernism and the highly subjective and individualistic values associated with modernism erased most impulses towards a dominant or monolithic American aesthetic. America's relationship with the figurative arts was just too little and too late, for the most part, to create the favorable conditions to breed artistic genius, as we have seen occur in Florence, Rome, London, and Paris. And the reason I bring all this up is because today our subject is one of the exceptions to this rule. Daniel Chester French was an American born into money and social connections whose path was unimpeded when he, at an early age, turned towards sculpture, and was indeed assisted down his path by the illustrious and the influential. He had no difficulty in gaining access to training in Europe, and when he embarked upon his career, he found himself in the perfect position to reap the benefits of a sculpture-hungry market, created and fostered by other American sculptors coming before him, such as Augustus St. Gaudens. And like many other hard-working and talented sculptors born under a lucky star, Dan French repaid the world by creating a masterpiece, a work of American art as iconic as the Statue of Liberty, but one that is even more quintessentially American. Daniel Chester French was born in the New England state of New Hampshire in 1850 to an influential lawyer and judge who eventually served as the United States Assistant Secretary to the Treasury. His family moved to Concord, Massachusetts when Daniel was 17, where he became friends with his neighbors, which included Louisa May Alcott, the famous author of the book Little Women, as well as the eminent transcendentalist poet Ralph Waldo Emerson. Dan French went to MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, for a year to study math before failing out of his studies, but it was around this time that he gained an interest in sculpture, probably from being exposed to it by Louisa May Alcott's sister, May, who was an artist herself and supplied Dan French with his first set of modeling tools and clay. He pursued clay modeling with enthusiasm, making models of various animals and birds almost entirely self-taught. In fact, from 1868, when he first started dabbling in clay, until 5 years later in 1873, when he received his first public monument commission, Daniel Chester French's artistic education consisted of a month-long stint in the New York studio of John Quincy Adams Ward, an anatomy course he took in Boston under William Rimmer, and self-directed study and open classes at the Boston Athenaeum. A few models he had made during this period he was able to sell to a ceramics manufacturer who reproduced his little decorative models for commercial sale. Very little of his work survives from this time, but we have to imagine that it was very impressive to his neighbors in the community of Concord, Massachusetts, because it was the town of Concord that awarded him the commission of his first monument. A century before that, in 1775, Concord had been the scene of the first battle in the Revolutionary War, fought by the militia known as the Minutemen, local citizens who could be called upon to fight with a single minute's notice. Concord wished to commemorate this battle with a statue of a Minuteman placed at Old North Bridge, the site of the Battle of Concord. Now, I haven't been able to discover if any other sculptor had been considered by the Memorial Committee other than the 24-year-old Daniel Chester French, but it doesn't appear to be the case. In any event, the Memorial Committee was stocked with family friends like Ralph Waldo Emerson, who supported the selection of French for the Minuteman statue. So, yeah, friends in high places was how French got his start. But Daniel Chester French relied on much more than social position to bring his work about. For instance, he listened to his father's opinions and criticism of his small-scale model. His father had a fairly good idea what the committee was looking for. Now, this willingness to listen to the opinions of others was a trait that French kept with him throughout his professional career, even much later when he was generally regarded to be the best sculptor in the United States. The young Dan French worked very hard to perfect the design of his Minuteman before submitting it. Having little experience with figure modeling from life up to this point, he wisely kept the pose simple and the details honest and plain. And as his model, he relied on the tried-and-true proportions and pose of the classical statue known as the Apollo Belvedere. French would have been able to study and work from the plaster cast of the Apollo Belvedere in the Boston Athenaeum. And finally, to complement all his hard work and research into the Minuteman statue, to really ensure that the committee would give him the commission, he offered his Minuteman statue at cost. So the end result, the Minuteman statue, is a remarkably good work for a largely untrained sculptor's first attempt at a life-size figure. In fact, it was and is ranked far above similar figures produced at the same time by career American sculptors like Henry Kirk Brown. Surprisingly, there is no trace of his classical model in the Minuteman. You don't really detect that it was made from the Apollo Belvedere. Rather, Daniel Chester French in this early work shows a vigorous and sure hand in modeling naturalistic detail, a trait that marks the work of his whole career. The Minuteman depicted in this work is a simple farmer striding forward with a musket in one hand and the other hand about to leave the handle of the plow he is abandoning in order to join the cause. The lowered hand on the handle of the plow is the main departure from the pose of the Apollo Belvedere, but it's enough to thoroughly disguise French's antique source. Having thus proved himself and revealing his artistic promise, French set sail for Italy to study in the studio of the American sculptor Thomas Ball in Florence. Again, this was all arranged through family connections, and he was invited to Ball's studio more like a guest than as a student. French left for Italy even before his Minuteman statue was unveiled in 1875. He stayed a year in Florence working under Thomas Ball, who was sort of a typical example of the American sculptors community in Florence in the 1870s, typical of the older generation, still churning out neoclassical figures and idealized portrait busts for the more conservative travelers on the Grand Tour. Daniel Chester French produced one statue in Florence in the neoclassical style, a reclining male nude, entitled The Awaking of Endymion. Now, this work really is notable only because it has nothing to do with anything else French ever sculpted before or since. Although he was learning the language of neoclassicism in the studio, he was much more interested in Michelangelo and in the Renaissance than in the work of Canova or Bartolini, both of whom had been dead for decades and whose neoclassical style was largely a thing of the past. Now, returning home to the United States in 1876, Dan French finds that he has several important commissions awaiting him. Several large sculptural groups, in fact, which were to decorate various federal governmental buildings in several cities like Boston, Philadelphia, and St. Louis. Now, these surprisingly choice commissions were just handed to him by the supervising architect of the United States Treasury. And, of course, the fact that Dan French's father was the current Assistant Secretary of the United States Treasury had everything to do with it. And actually, the nepotism was so obvious that Dan French almost didn't accept the commissions. But in the end, of course, he took them. You know, it's funny. I usually find the origin stories of sculptors and how they got their careers off the ground to be terribly interesting. But French, he just had it so easy. His origin story is kind of boring to me. Because of his connections and his wealth, it's clear that he would have had some sort of career in sculpture regardless of his talent. But it's to Dan French's credit that he made full use of all the natural as well as the societal gifts bestowed upon him, never resting on his laurels, never shy of working and reworking an idea tirelessly until it was exactly what he wanted, never not trying his best. And that's an important thing to remember when looking at his biography or the biographies of any artist who seems to have an easy time at the beginning. Once you're given those first opportunities, you have to come through on your work because nepotism or connections only gets you in the door. You then have to produce quality work which lives up to the chance that people took on you. Your father's friends will only commission so much work from you, so you have to capitalize on the opportunity by demonstrating that you're capable of doing good work good enough to be bought by people who are not your father's friends. And that's just what Daniel Chester French did. The commissions for these public buildings were a series of allegorical figures and groups with titles like Peace and Vigilance, Law, Prosperity, and Power, Science controlling the forces of electricity and steam, and so on. Dan French did the modeling, and the carving into marble was subcontracted out, and they were sufficiently good that other orders soon followed. From 1876 to 1883, Daniel Chester French was more or less constantly employed by the federal government for decorative and allegorical statuary. Most of these early decorative works no longer survive. Now, in addition to the federal projects, French executed several portrait busts, including his old family friend, Ralph Waldo Emerson, and a seated statue in bronze of John Harvard, founder of Harvard University in Cambridge, Massachusetts. While all of these works, at least the ones that survive, are good, solid works, none are particularly notable, with the exception of his first statue, the Minuteman. This is French's early period. The shift towards a more individual style and original work comes only after a short stay in Paris, which French undertook in 1886 for about 8 months. Now, it had always been French's plan to visit and study in Paris, but due to his work commitments, he had put it off for several years. One of French's goals connected to his stay in Paris was to better acquaint himself with the techniques of bronze casting, and to truly understand how to model in clay meant to be cast in bronze, rather than how to model for a marble statue. Now, up to this point, only the Minuteman statue and his statue of John Harvard had been made in bronze, and French had felt challenged by the task of modeling the John Harvard statue for bronze, uncertain as he was about what the eventual effect of his modeling would have when reproduced in metal and placed out of doors. Now, French spent the fall of 1886 and the spring of 1887 in Paris, and during this time, he made the model for yet another governmental commission, a portrait statue of the Michigan Senator Lewis Cass, which was eventually carved in marble. And even though it was carved in marble and not cast in bronze, there is a distinct change evident in Daniel Chester French's modeling style, which betrays the influence of the so-called French manner of clay modeling, then popular in Paris, and imitated in England and eventually the United States. In Paris, French filled in the gaps of his artistic education by learning to rely more heavily on professional live models, using a more visually oriented approach than the neoclassical style he had learned from Thomas Ball in Florence. And speaking of live models, one interesting little tidbit from his Parisian stay was that for his statue of Lewis Cass, the governor from Michigan, French used a professional life model, the very same life model that Augustus St. Gaudens had used for his statue of Admiral David Farragut, modeled in Paris 10 years earlier. Augustus St. Gaudens and Daniel Chester French had come to know and respect each other back in the United States over that last decade, and French had been able to see firsthand St. Gaudens' mastery of the French manner and the new Beaux-Arts style, which St. Gaudens was popularizing in New England at the time. The two sculptors were only 2 years apart in age, although Augustus St. Gaudens' reputation had been established much earlier than French's, in part due to St. Gaudens' more progressive French style versus the Italian neoclassical style, which informed French's sculpture and which was preferred for governmental commissions. Now, St. Gaudens' career served somewhat as a model for French, and St. Gaudens, always eager to help other sculptors out, would in the near future play an important role in helping French establish his reputation. But back to Paris in 1887. Now, as Dan French was finishing his model of Senator Lewis Cass for the Capitol Rotunda in Washington, D.C., French received word that he had been awarded a commission he had been hoping to secure for 2 years. Like his John Harvard portrait statue, this new commission was to be a seated statue in bronze commemorating the founder of another educational institution. And the subject of the statue was Thomas Hopkins Gallaudet. Now, Thomas Gallaudet was a pioneering educator for the deaf in the United States. His personal history is fascinating. He had graduated from Yale and was pursuing the path towards becoming a minister when, in 1813, he met Alice Cogswell, the deaf 9-year-old daughter of a neighbor. Gallaudet became passionately intrigued with developing methods of communication for the deaf, enough to travel to England to study methods of deaf communication with English researchers in that field. And he was met with a lot of resistance, as these English educators felt rather proprietary about their techniques and wished to keep their methods to themselves. So Gallaudet ended up going to France for his education in deaf communication and brought what he had learned back to the United States, opening up the American School for the Deaf, the first of its kind in the U.S. And this is why, today, American Sign Language has more in common in terms of syntax and grammar with the French language than with the English language. Gallaudet's son, Edward Gallaudet, founded the first college for the deaf in Washington, D.C. in 1864, and today bears the name Gallaudet University. And this was the proposed site for a statue of Thomas Hopkins Gallaudet. The statue, unveiled in 1889, depicts Thomas Gallaudet seated, like so many portrait statues which have come before, but unlike so many sculptures of the genre, Daniel Chester French transforms his commemorative statue into an intimate and charming narrative sculpture, with the addition of Gallaudet's 9-year-old student, Alice Cogswell. She stands at the side of Gallaudet's chair, leaning into his chest in the familiar and unself-conscious way that children do, and holding out a clenched fist. She is looking intently into Gallaudet's face, who is looking back at her with tender kindness, and his own right hand is also clenched into a fist. With those fists, both Gallaudet and Alice Cogswell are making the hand sign for the letter A. The work, in fact, depicts Thomas Gallaudet teaching the alphabet to his young pupil. Now, this is one of the most intimate, tender sculptures that I can think of, something that would be right at home, being produced on a small, intimate scale, maybe for domestic decoration. The fact that this sculpture serves equally as well as a public commemorative statue is remarkable. Now, usually when sculptors try to go beyond simple depiction in public commemorative portrait statuary, they usually turn to allegorical motifs, such as the so-called chair of state behind Augustus St. Gaudens's standing Lincoln, or the plow in French's own Minuteman. Otherwise, portrait subjects might be shown at their moment of greatest significance, doing something like signing a treaty or leading a charge or killing an enemy. But here, in French's Gallaudet, we seem to find the opposite, a small, fleeting, intimate moment, made all the more powerful by being rendered in a permanent, public, and monumental form. It's a novel take on notions of greatness and significance in public sculpture, and it is one of my favorite sculptures by any American. Having said all that, though, I do have a nagging question about the design of the Gallaudet statue that I can't seem to find the answer to. And the question is, did Daniel Chester French take inspiration for the quiet, intimate tone of his novel commemorative statue from another sculptor's work? I'm thinking of Augustus St. Gaudens's Standing Lincoln, which I just mentioned, another of the sort of man in a suit on a pedestal genre, but singular for its sense of quiet introspection, a sense which, like the Gallaudet, is contrary to the standard expression of commemorative statuary. Now, the Standing Lincoln was finished in 1887 and placed in Chicago. The Gallaudet was unveiled just in 1889. The sculptors were professional acquaintances, and it just seems unlikely that French wouldn't have seen St. Gaudens's design sometime in the mid-1880s, before either statue was completed and cast. Both these statues are very original and excellent sculptures in their own right, as well as very different from each other, except for the novelty of their introspective tone. And it doesn't take anything away from French's Gallaudet statue to make this comparison of similar expressive tones. I'm just wondering how much of a coincidence it is or not. And we'll hear more about Daniel Chester French's work and the stylistic debts he positively did owe to Augustus St. Gaudens when the sculptor's funeral continues. Yes, I know, this episode is very late. I have left you guys hanging for a while, and for that I do apologize. It's just been a kind of a busy time for me, and looking at my calendar, it doesn't seem like it's going to get any less busy anytime soon. So from here on out, I'm not going to make any scheduling promises I may not be able to keep, but just know that I am very far from finishing what I have started, so more episodes to come. And speaking of schedules, I'm going to be in the Boise, Idaho area in just a few weeks. I'm teaching an intensive short marble carving course on the campus of Boise State University for 2 weeks in May. I didn't advertise this one on the podcast because it's a closed workshop. It's just for BSU sculpture students. But I thought I'd mention it here just in case I have any listeners out there in the Boise area who are not going to be attending the workshop. If so, drop me a message on Facebook or something, if you want to meet up and get a beer. I'm going to be back in Florence right after the workshop, which ends in late May. But then I'm going to be back in the United States again in July, and this time San Jose, California, teaching a workshop at the School of Visual Philosophy. It's going to be a 7-day evening and weekend course in modeling a figure from life in water-based clay. I'm going to be teaching the sight-size technique of clay modeling, which is an almost purely visual method of constructing figures in clay, closely related to the 19th century so-called French manner method of clay modeling that you hear me going on about in so many different podcasts. And this workshop's enrollment is open to the public, but I think it's going to fill up real quickly. So to enroll, cruise on over to www.schoolofvisualphilosophy.com, all one word, and you can find the course listing in the classes they offer there. So that's from July 23rd to the 29th. And again, the class times are all in the evenings on the weekdays, and then with 2 classes scheduled during the day on the weekend. So you don't have to get the week off of work to attend. And even if you can't make the class, I'm going to be giving a lecture at the School of Visual Philosophy that is free and open to the public on Saturday, July 29th, and it would be great to see you there if you're in the area. I don't exactly know what I'm going to be talking about just yet, but I'll try to make it worth your time. And I know I've got some listeners in the Bay Area, so come on out. It'd be great to meet you. Get in touch, and I'll see you in San Jose. So after the monument to Gallaudet, Daniel Chester French enjoyed a steady stream of commissions for most of his career, almost all in the form of commemorative monuments. It was the heyday for commemorative monuments, the 1880s and 1890s, with the motivation of commemoration of the fallen in the American Civil War and other military campaigns, and this impulse dovetailed nicely into the City Beautiful movement I mentioned in the podcast on that topic. Now, naturally, the public commissions were awarded by civic groups or universities or governments. But one of the ways that wealthy private citizens could respond to and participate in the beautification of public spaces, as well as display their wealth, was through the commissioning of elaborate funerary monuments to be placed in public cemeteries. So places like Mount Auburn Cemetery outside of Boston and Sleepy Hollow Cemetery right in Concord, Massachusetts, are now repositories for significant sculpture produced by American artists during these decades. And Daniel Chester French was to find a good deal of success in the funereal realm. In 1889, French was awarded a commission to commemorate 2 brothers of the Millmore family, to be installed in Forest Hill Cemetery in Massachusetts. Now, these 2 brothers, Martin and James Millmore, had died a few years apart from each other, and the widow of James Millmore, who had once been the fiancée of Martin Millmore before he died, had commissioned a single monument to honor both men. Now, in addition to their shared love interest, the 2 brothers shared professions as well. They had both been sculptors. So rather than present the 2 brothers in portrait statuary, what Daniel Chester French decided to do was to employ a novel, ideal, and allegorical motif. He combined the identities of the 2 brothers into a single figure, a figure wearing what appears to be a simple artisan's apron, as well as some sort of leggings or stockings like you might find in a pre-Raphaelite or Neo-Florentine figure. So the figure appears to be sort of an idealistic Renaissance sculptor rather than a contemporary of Daniel Chester French. Now, it's a figure realistically rendered, but the clothing suggests a more timeless representation rather than a particular identity. And it's done in a very clever and understated way. Now, this figure of a sculptor is rendered fully in the round, although he is posed with his back to the viewer, more or less facing a large upright slab, in a way that kind of gives this fully three-dimensional figure the feeling of being a part of a relief. Now, with his back to us, the sculptor holds a mallet and a chisel, and he's caught in the middle of carving a relief of an Egyptian sphinx into the slab. However, standing at the other end of this slab is what is clearly an allegorical angel, complete with toga and wings. Her arm is outstretched towards the sculptor, and her gentle touch stays the hand of the sculptor in the middle of his work. She is the angel of death, halting the pursuit of the sculptor in the middle of his toils. The Sphinx relief which the sculptor is carving is more than just a funereal reference. The Milmore brothers actually, in their life, collaborated on a Sphinx sculpture which is in the Mount Auburn Cemetery. It's a fantastic and original composition, and even more original in its conception. I think many listeners actually are familiar with this particular sculpture, and if you're not, well, then you've never been to the Facebook group page or the website for the Sculptor's Funeral podcast, because I use an image of this sculpture as one of the primary logos for the podcast. I mean, of course I do, right? I mean, what better image can represent a podcast which eulogizes sculptors than an image of a sculpture which eulogizes sculptors? Now, French created a work here that is both peacefully mournful and at the same time slightly energetic. It's full of implied action, and yet also full of stillness. There's a soulfulness that strongly references both the Neo-Florentine movement in Paris as well as the symbolist new sculpture movement underway at the same time in London. In some ways, it's French's most fully Beaux-Arts Parisian-influenced work, and so maybe it should come as no surprise to hear that he actually shipped a plaster model of this work to Paris. He went to Paris himself to fully recreate the work again in clay to finish it off, and then had it cast in a Parisian foundry into bronze. Now, this is the only time he had a bronze monument designed in the U.S. to be cast in France. I think he was partially motivated to do so in order to more fully breathe in the Beaux-Arts flavor that he evidently wanted this work to exude. But I also think that he saw this as an opportunity to have his work recognized abroad. And indeed it was. It was favorably recognized and received by all who saw it. The finished bronze was exhibited at the Salon des Champs de Mars in Paris, where it was awarded a bronze medal before French had it shipped back to the United States. And meanwhile, French shipped the plaster cast of the Melvin Memorial to New York for display in exhibitions there. Finally, the finished bronze arrived in the U.S. in time to be displayed at the Palace of Arts in the 1893 World Columbian Exposition, also known as the 1893 Chicago World's Fair. His monument was given a prominent place in the Hall of Arts, and it, along with his colossal statue called the Republic, which he had made for the Fairgrounds Lagoon, catapulted Daniel Chester French into the national spotlight. Now, I've already talked about French's enormous and temporary statue, known as the Republic, in an earlier episode, the one that covered the Chicago World's Fair as well as the City Beautiful movement. And I recommend you check that podcast out, as well as the episodes on Augusta St. Gaudens, if you haven't already. A large portion of Daniel Chester French's work is influenced either by St. Gaudens' sculpture or, more directly, by the man himself. For instance, St. Gaudens was the director of sculpture for the Chicago World's Fair, and so he was the one who selected Daniel Chester French for the statue of the Republic, as well as for other works at the fair. For another example of St. Gaudens' influence, take a look at the St. Gaudens memorial relief to Colonel Shaw, which he had begun around 1885, but would not be installed until 1897. Yeah, so take a look at the Colonel Shaw monument, and then take a look at the Milmore Memorial done by Daniel Chester French, and it just hardly seems possible that French's look and form for his Milmore Memorial, that of a full-scale, high relief, could have been coincidentally so similar to the Shaw Memorial, right down to the sort of gentle arc which tops the framing of both works. In fact, now that I think of it, is it possible that French finished and cast his Melvin Memorial in Paris rather than in New England to avoid the inevitable comparisons to the clay model being constructed of the Shaw Monument in St. Gaudens's studio? It doesn't seem out of the realm of possibility, at least not to me. French and St. Gaudens were friends, but they were professional rivals as well. And in some of French's correspondence, one does detect a hint of, well, if not animosity towards St. Gaudens, then at least a little bit of, attitude or jealousy. He complains, actually, about being compared to St. Gaudens by his critics. He, on one occasion, is a bit rude and defensive when St. Gaudens is called in by an architect to critique French's work in what should have been a professional and congenial meeting of minds. Now, French is never explicit about his feelings of ill will in writing that I've seen, and it certainly doesn't seem to be anything personal towards St. Gaudens himself, but you definitely get a sense when you read his letters that Daniel Chester French, I think, chafed a bit at having to live and work in the shadow of the great Augustus St. Gaudens. Now, I wonder how Dan French felt about being awarded the commission for 4 monumental allegories to sit in front of the newly built U.S. Customs House in New York City, a commission first offered to both him and Augustus St. Gaudens jointly, but which St. Gaudens had to decline because he was too busy with other work. Now, instead of hiring another sculptor to take St. Gaudens' place, the architect just gave all 4 statues directly to French. And I imagine this must have been a clear signal to Daniel Chester French that he was finally being viewed as St. Gaudens' peer, and in the United States at least, otherwise peerless. Now, certainly there were other sculptors in America available and willing to take St. Gaudens' place, so giving all 4 statues to French spoke volumes about his growing reputation. Now, the Customs House commissions are 4 large figure groups representing the 4 continents, a genre that has been around for centuries, in which the known world is depicted with representations of allegories of various geography, right? So the Albert Memorial in London has a similar motif of the 4 continents, but we can also look to Bernini's 4 Rivers fountain in Piazza Navona in Rome as another of the type. Jean-Baptiste Carpeau's 4 Continents fountain in Paris is yet another example. Now, in Daniel Chester French's allegories, we see that these groups, stylistically, would have been right at home on the Albert Memorial in London, loaded as they are with symbolist content, as well as ethnographic stereotypes typical of the day. You've got the allegory of Asia, for example, sitting with her back to a Christian cross, flanked by several wasted figures who, in Dan French's own words, represent the hordes of India and the hopelessness of the life of so many of the inhabitants. The figure of Asia herself sits on a throne partially constructed of skulls. Meanwhile, the allegory of Europe, she wears a crown and she kind of leans casually with her arm resting on a globe as if she owned the world. And then, of course, the figure group of America has the obligatory subdued Indian savage, a type all too common in 19th century American allegorical work. The allegory of Africa, interestingly, is the least offensive of the groups and depicts Africa as a drowsy, drooping figure resting upon a sphinx and a lion's head, designed to, quote, express the mystery of the deserts and the unexplored recesses of Africa's primeval forests. Now, in the writing of various critics, these works have been called some of the best examples of architectural sculpture in America. And, yeah, if we ignore the actual messages the work conveys, they may be right. But I will leave it up to you to work out whether it's possible to fully value a work of art while ignoring its intent. Now, let's lighten the mood a bit by returning to the cemetery. In 1906, Daniel Chester French receives another funerary commission honoring another set of brothers, 3 brothers of the Melvin family of Concord, Massachusetts, who all died in the American Civil War. The Melvin Monument consists of a single figure in relief on a tall vertical slab in the center of an exedra, a type of seating area or curved bench connected to such a monument, made popular by Augustus St. Gaudens with his monument to Admiral Farragut. And the exedra is an architectural motif which French himself has used on previous occasions for other very similar monuments. But the reason I'm singling out the Melvin Memorial among these other several similar commemorative works that French produced is because of the relief figure in the memorial's center, an allegorical figure given the name of Morning Victory. The idea of a figure of victory in mourning placed on a military memorial is certainly not new, but the way in which French sculpts this allegory is, and its novel design places this work among his masterpieces. Now, normally, we can describe a figure in relief as being either high relief or low relief or somewhere in between. The description depends on how far the figure projects from the back plane of the relief, right? If it projects a little bit, it's low relief. If it projects a lot, it's high relief. But these terms don't apply to the Morning Victory. She doesn't project from the back plane at all. She is sunken into it. The upper half of the semi-nude figure, clutching an olive branch in one outstretched arm and lifting a veil with the other, this figure appears to be rendered fully in the round, but she's in a tightly contoured recess, as though she's emerging from the center of the marble slab itself. Her head and wind-tossed hair is deeply undercut, creating a volume of shadow which seems to project the notion of a figure emerging from the darkness and into the light at the surface of the stone. Her drapery does succeed in projecting a little bit out of this recess, where it simply just melts into the surface of the slab. Okay, so I haven't really done a good job of describing this work. It's just one of those sculptures that you need to see in order to understand what I'm trying to describe. And as always, you can check out the image gallery for this episode, which is episode number 70, at thesculptorsfuneral.com. But if you've ever looked up the Sculptor's Funeral podcast on iTunes, you might actually already know this work because, like the Melvin Memorial, I use an image of French's Morning Victory as a logo for the podcast on iTunes. It's just that French was really effective with his funerary monuments, so I found his work to be a natural choice when I started looking for graphics for the podcast. So if you've always wondered where I got these images from, now you know. So this figure of the Morning Victory, seemingly emerging from her marble block, is actually not the earliest instance of Daniel Chester French designing a relief in this way. A few years prior to the Melvin Memorial, French completed his monument to the American historian Francis Parkman, which has a very similar overall design to the Melvin Memorial, complete with a figure sunken into the background plane and seemingly emerging from within the slab. And in the instance of the Parkman Memorial, it's a figure of an American Indian. So apparently Daniel Chester French just saw further potential for this motif than what he had achieved with the Parkman Memorial, and so we can almost see the Parkman Memorial as a rough draft for the Melvin Memorial. Anyway, the novelty of this figure, sunken into the background plane of a relief, was one aspect of what made this memorial a popular success, but another aspect of it is just the sheer beauty of the design, composition, and solid yet sensual rendering of the figure. The heavy shroud which the figure is lifting from her face is actually an American flag, but it serves also as a more traditional motif of a mourning veil, a device that French had also successfully used with the Angel of Death on the Melvin Memorial. And it's also a motif similar to what he had seen Augustus St. Gaudens use for his Adams Memorial to a very good effect. So the Melvin Memorial was completed in 1908, but the figure of the Morning Victory on the memorial proved to be so popular that the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City decided to buy a copy of it in 1912. Likewise, the Met also bought a marble copy of the Melvin Memorial, now given the title The Angel of Death and the Sculptor, and they bought that in 1922. The interesting thing about the Morning Victory, as it appears at the Met Museum, is that the figure is actually reversed. It's the mirror image of the original memorial in Concord. However, the reversed image in the Met is actually the way Daniel Chester French made the clay model. I know this is weird and kind of confusing, but bear with me here. Basically, when the siting for the Concord Memorial was decided upon, how it was going to sit in the landscape, that was decided apparently after Daniel Chester French had finished his clay model. It was found that the approach to the monument, that is, how you walked up a certain path to view the work, it was kind of on the unfavorable side of the monument. In other words, if the marble had been sculpted like the clay model was modeled, the figure's upraised arm would have blocked your view of the face as you approach the monument. But by reversing the image, her face is clearly seen as you approach. All right, so the guys who carved the marble version of the Melvin Memorial, the famous Piccirilli brothers of New York, carved a reversed or mirrored version of the original clay model. So that, of course, raises a very interesting question. How do you reverse a clay model? How do you take a model and then carve a mirror image in marble? Well, you probably already know that marble sculptures are pointed up from plaster casts of clay models using a macchinetta a punto, otherwise known as a pointing machine. I've actually got a YouTube video which demonstrates the pointing machine if you're not already familiar. So the pointing machine is one way to transfer measurements from your plaster cast into your marble, but it's not the only way. You can also use compasses to take the same kinds of measurements. I'm not going to go into detail here, as it would be impossible to just verbally describe the technique, but if you use the compass technique, it is possible to reverse the measurements as you take them off the plaster cast and produce a mirror copy of your original. Maybe I'll do a demonstration video on this technique sometime soon and post it on YouTube. I don't know. Anyway, back to the Morning Victory. In Concord, Massachusetts, in the cemetery there, you're going to see her with her left arm outstretched, and the version in the Met, you're going to find that it's her right arm outstretched. The Met version is also 1/3 smaller in scale than the first original version. And by the way, reducing scale or enlarging scale is also another advantage of using the compass system for pointing up marble. You can enlarge and reduce. So yeah, it sounds like I'm definitely going to have to do a demo video on compass technique. It's pretty cool. It was right around this time, during the sculpting of the Morning Victory, that the preeminent sculptor of the United States, Augustus St. Gaudens, died at the age of 60. Daniel Chester French, himself at the age of 58, now became the nation's master of sculpture in his own right, peerless in reputation and skill. And yet, he was not entirely free of St. Gaudens' shadow. Less than a year after St. Gaudens' death, French was commissioned for a statue to be placed at the state capital of Nebraska in the city of Lincoln. And that statue was to be of the man for whom the town was named, Abraham Lincoln. Once again, French and his work would inevitably be viewed in relation, at least indirectly, to St. Gaudens, who had produced 2 statues of Lincoln in the previous decades, which I discussed in the St. Gaudens episodes. Now, one of these statues, known as the Standing Lincoln in Chicago's Lincoln Park, had become a fairly iconic rendering of the great emancipator. Now, I've already mentioned this work in relation to Dan French's Gallaudet Memorial. St. Gaudens' Standing Lincoln has his head bowed in thought or concentration, which is a stark departure of the usual depiction of great men whose faces were usually turned towards the distant horizon with authoritative expressions of power or dignity, majesty, or something of that nature. Now, this personal, inward-looking portrait in the Standing Lincoln was, as I mentioned, an innovation, and it was a motif that would be used again by many artists in representing not only Lincoln, but other men and women in power, in order to humanize them. And Daniel Chester French, once again, could not avoid St. Gaudens' influence. Working with his usual architectural collaborator, the architect Henry Bacon, French and Bacon together designed a preliminary sketch for the Nebraska Lincoln Monument that can be easily mistaken for St. Gaudens' Standing Lincoln, right down to the broad exedra which encircles the Standing Lincoln in Chicago. Now, this was later gotten rid of, and the architectural design was then simplified, mostly for financial reasons, to consist simply of a granite background slab with the Gettysburg Address inscribed on it, and then Dan French's figure of Lincoln standing in front. Now, this Lincoln stands with his head bowed, like St. Gaudens' figure does, but French's is bowed even lower. St. Gaudens' Lincoln appears to have just risen and taken a step forward, and with his hand on his lapel, possibly is on the verge of speaking. In contrast, French's Lincoln stands decidedly still in a subtle contrapposto, with the bent leg off to the side rather than behind, indicating a stillness rather than motion. His hands are clasped together, gripping each other down in front at waist level. And I would say that the main difference in tone between these two Lincoln statues is that St. Gaudens's Lincoln is deep in thought, while French's Lincoln is positively lost in thought, striking an almost forlorn pose, which seems to signal there is no one else in the room. So good on Daniel Chester French for finding a new expression for St. Gaudens's model of pensiveness. But it has to be said that French's Lincoln is just not as successful as his predecessor. From some angles, in fact, the posture of French's Lincoln is so forlorn and quiet, it resembles the posture of a small child after being scolded. There's something about the figure that just appears weak and powerless, at least to me. Maybe Daniel Chester French had completed so many funerary monuments that he didn't quite realize how mournful his Lincoln seems from some angles. But again, that's just my own opinion, and when the statue was unveiled in 1912, it certainly met with a great deal of acclaim and success. And the sculptor himself certainly thought of it as one of his best works. In fact, he even marketed a small-scale edition of this figure. He actually wanted the commissioning committee to allow him to reproduce full-scale replicas, as he thought other clients might well want one. And in a letter to architect Henry Bacon, French wrote, "I am wondering what I should do if anyone else did want a statue of Lincoln. I could not make another as good as this, and it would be but little pleasure to make one inferior to it." Now that's a quote from Daniel Chester French that would soon become ironic, as he wrote it just months before receiving the commission of a lifetime, the commission of a statue that is now an American icon, equal to the Statue of Liberty and Mount Rushmore, and perhaps today more beloved than either of the others. And I'm speaking, of course, of the colossal statue of Abraham Lincoln at the Abraham Lincoln National Memorial on the National Mall in Washington, D.C. And the story of the creation of the Lincoln Memorial, the people who made it happen, as well as the people who tried to oppose it, and its tumultuous role as the cultural battlefield of the United States, is the subject of our next podcast. Well, I want to thank you all for listening. And just to reassure you, I am already at work on the next episode, so you won't have to wait as long as you did for this one. Thanks for your patience. And also thanks for your complaints when I didn't show up on time. It makes me feel good to know that after 70 episodes, people still want more. So keep those complaints rolling in. Now don't forget you can check out additional content at the Sculptor's Funeral YouTube channel or on our Facebook group page. And while you're there, you can join in the conversation with almost 1,000 other listeners. You can also subscribe to the podcast at Stitcher Mobile or iTunes, or subscribe from any service from which you get your podcasts, and so you can receive new episodes of the podcast automatically on your PC, tablet, or mobile device as soon as they air. And if you want to help the podcast reach other people like yourself, leave a review of The Sculptor's Funeral or give the podcast a rating at iTunes or wherever you subscribe. Check out the sculptorsfuneral.com website where you can stream the complete archives of the show. You can also check out the image galleries for this and for each episode. You can support the podcast by buying some Sculptor's Funeral merchandise. And finally, if you happen to need to stock your studio, click on the link Blick Art Supplies at thesculptorsfuneral.com. Clicking on the link and buying from Blick helps to support the podcast, and for that, I thank you. Thanks again for listening, and have a productive week.